ask the military to go solve the problem.
We encouraged nationalism. We encouraged in the guise of self-determination. We never said to countries or to ethnic groups around the world that it's useful to have an idea larger than yourself or than your own language or your own religion in organizing a government.
Because the Dayton Agreement was achieved literally at the point of a gun, rather than by genuine compromise, it was inherently unstable, dependent on outside force to keep the Bosnian Serb and Muslim Croat republics from colliding under a central government dominated by Alija Izetbegović. To win the backing of Congress for deployment of U.S. forces in Bosnia in December of 1995, President Clinton promised that the troops would be back by December 1996, a month after his election. But 4 years after their deployment, U.S. troops remain in Bosnia.
NATO is an army of occupation, very much an army of occupation. It's not a peacekeeping force, it's an occupying force.
90% of the financial aid went to the Muslim Croat entity. Serbs were singled out by the International War Crimes Tribunal, whose staff was dominated by Americans. Yet, by the end of the war in Bosnia, a survey conducted by the U.S. Information Agency of Serbs, Muslims, and Croats reported that on a percentage basis, Serbs were more likely to have lost a family member during the conflict than either Croats or Muslims. The tribunal was controversial among legal experts from the outside because it was set up under the UN Security Council, where permanent members such as the US, England, and Russia could use their veto power to block investigations of their own military activities or those of their client states.
An international court, illegal in its conception. The Security Council has no authority under the UN Charter to create a criminal court. There would never been a UN if it had tried to establish that authority, because none of the powers in World War II would have abided by it for a moment.
But the United States, in its endeavor, because it was the country that pushed for the establishment of the tribunal. Madeleine Albright, then Ambassador Albright, was the single person most responsible, without any question, for the setting up, for the establishment of the tribunal.
Madeleine Albright, who would soon become U.S. Secretary of State, had repeatedly used the threat of a veto in the UN Security Council to block resolutions condemning Muslim and Croat atrocities.
I think it's clear that Madeleine Albright has not been impartial in her treatment of this war. She's been extremely one-sided, and in fact, so too have a number of people within the U.S. administration.
It's very clear that the United States was taking sides, that it was attempting to punish and criticize Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia for activities that it did not punish Croats for.
There have been complaints on the Serb side that we were less efficient in investigating war crimes committed against Serbs, which undoubtedly happened. One of the reasons it was difficult was the non-cooperation from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia.
But critics say that the War Crimes Tribunal failed to investigate well-documented reports by both the Yugoslav State Commission on War Crimes and independent human rights groups.
They've put an excessive emphasis on crimes against the Muslims and have been less willing than they should have been to accept evidence coming in from the Serbian side of atrocities against the Serbs.
In the eyes of some experts in international law, the tribunal used a double standard when it indicted Bosnian Serb leaders Radovan Karadzic and General Ratko Mladic for abuses committed by soldiers in the field, while failing to hold Muslim and Croat leaders, such as Alija Izetbegović and Franjo Tudjman, accountable for similar abuses by soldiers under their command. In its first 4 years of existence, the ad hoc tribunal did little to prosecute well-documented atrocities by Muslim and Croat forces. No indictments were issued for Tomislav Merčep and Branimir Glavaš, who had been identified by Croatian police reports as leaders of death squads. Merčep serves as mayor of Vukovar, and Glavaš became the mayor of Osijek. Nasser Orić, the Muslim paramilitary leader who initiated the cycle of violence and retribution around Srebrenica, now runs a disco in Tuzla. In March of 1999, investigators for the tribunal recommended indictments for 3 generals who, 4 years earlier, had had planned the bloody Operation Storm. But no indictments were issued against the American generals who advised them. According to New York Times reporter Raymond Bonner, the Pentagon refused to provide crucial evidence, aerial photos related to the targeting of Serbian civilians in the town of Knin. And no indictment was announced by the tribunal against the man who conducted the bloody artillery barrage against civilians in Operation Storm, General Agim Ceku, an ethnic Albanian who had served the Croatian army as commander of artillery. Ceku, who was linked to other bloody massacres in Krajina, would soon take a leading role in a new conflict, a war in the Serbian province of Kosovo. The Dayton Accords, which finally halted fighting in Bosnia, significantly changed the power base of Serbian President Milosevic. Because the provisions of the accord were unpopular among Serbs, the United States depended on Milosevic to enforce it. In turn, because of his increasing unpopularity in Serbia, Milosevic looked to his new working relationship with the United States to bolster his stature.
This was the first time the Americans were overtly getting involved into the whole Bosnia-Balkan situation, putting forward their troops in NATO into the region. They wanted it to work, and at the same time, the Serbs at home deeply resented Milosevic's policies. It had cost them West Slavonia, it cost them the Krajina, it cost them a third of Bosnia. They had thousands of soldiers and citizens dead. Their economy was in ruins. They had the sanctions against them, and they blamed Milosevic, who had proclaimed he could protect them or would do great things for them. Of course, he'd been defeated, and they were protesting in the hundreds of thousands in the streets against his leadership and against his presidency.
For once, quarreling members of Serbia's political opposition put aside their differences and managed to win local elections in key cities, including Belgrade, Niš, and Novi Sad. They were ready to take on Milosevic in the upcoming campaign for the presidency of Serbia.
And at that time, they were looking eagerly for some sort of sign from the Americans to be able to push this over the edge, and they didn't get it.
In fact, unlike European governments which were shunning Milosevic, the U.S. sent 2 high-level missions to help bolster his stature as the guarantor of the Dayton Accords. Both Madeleine Albright, who had been promoted to Secretary of State, and Richard Holbrooke made official visits to Milosevic in Belgrade. When Milosevic manipulated election rules to guarantee his re-election, the opposition called a boycott. Richard Holbrooke, however, denounced the boycott, and eventually it fizzled. It was not the first time Milosevic used his presumed adversaries to help him maintain power. As early as 1992, during the Bosnian conflict, the U.S. cleared the way for Milan Panic, an American businessman of Yugoslav origin, to serve as Yugoslav Prime Minister. As Prime Minister, Panic quickly offered major concessions on policies towards the Bosnian conflict and began a dialogue with moderate Kosovo-Albanian leader Ibrahim Rugova. When Panic decided to challenge Milosevic for the presidency of Serbia, however, the Kosovo Albanians, who held the balance of power, continued to boycott Serbian elections, which left Milosevic in power, a convenient adversary in their goal of a separate state for Kosovo. But democracy in Serbia would be set back again, and Albanian moderates such as Rugova would soon lose out to an increasingly violent organization known as the KLA.
The German Secret Service played a very important role later in supporting the terrorist groups in Serbia.
German BND operatives trained KLA troops, picked their officers, and provided them with an arsenal of ammunition. In April of 1996, the KLA announced itself to the world through a series of assassinations of civilians and police in Kosovo.
Inside Kosovo, they clearly represented a modest-sized minority. I would estimate no more than 15 to 20% of the Kosovo Albanians supported the KLA. But they have international roots in Europe and America as well.